The problem is these agreements don't work because there's already massive conflict that exists here. People disagree about what exactly you want, which is why the war continues to exist. We know that when you try to split a country in half, we know what happens. We saw the chaos that happened in Germany. We saw what happened in Sri Lanka when there was massive conflict as a consequence of these partitions existing. Two arguments in my speech, but before that, a few areas of setup. First of all, we think the civil war exists as a consequence of the RSF and in the West and the SAF in the East. Importantly, the RSF have gold mines, but no sea routes or agricultural land. The SAF have these routes, but lack things like gold mines to some extent, right? We think the problem right now then is there's massive disagreement over this. Two, the alternatives that we would propose on our side is not a ceasefire because we think, like they said, this is probably similar to their case. We want African countries to intervene within these areas through Khartoum, split it on that area and expand inwards. A military offensive invasion that will always, that in many instances we will prove will result in a far better area and far better peace in the long run as well. Finally, the reason why these areas are fighting is not through ethnic lines. Like they say, it's primarily through political lines. It is the elitist nature between the right and the left, the east and the west rather, that disagree over exactly what kind of policies they want to pass. Two arguments. The first argument is why this partition will hurt these countries. There are three things I want to prove here. The first is economic. Notice these countries right now, even through conflict, are often tied through various supply chains. Like the East and the West requires some kind of collusion with each other in order to function quite effectively. They're built on these incredibly fragmented lines. The problem, though, then is on their side, stability is incredibly questioned because it is hard to govern a country without half of these resources. Because, for example, the people in the West lack this agriculture that they require to buy from these countries in order to actually feed them. And this only works not through partitioning, but through direct and indirect access routes that exist independent to the existence of these agreements. But two, the people on the East, for example, lack things like port. So they might have things like gold, but they can't sell this gold very easily unless they go over to the West, which makes it incredibly difficult to liquefy these things and buy things that can fund and feed their people. The problem again is this was not based on ethnic lines. It was as a result of massive mismanagement by these governments. As a consequence of this, it is incredibly unclear why economically you don't cripple these countries in the long run. Why do we then think there's an incentive to keep fighting within these regions? Because their biggest push from proposition is that we're able to stop the war, stop the blood, and that is a good thing. We think there are three reasons as to why this will not stop. The first thing is a lot of the people in power require control to maximize their profits. Like you need the port and you need the gold in order to actually make this as profitable. Like sure, there might be indirect routes, but obviously these indirect routes aren't as clean, which is why for you to actually maximize your influence and to establish your regime, you don't only want to have your slice of land, but expand over to the other side to have access to all the gold and all the ports. And this is exactly the very premise that the war is based on. But two, the only way the proposition and the only way these military leaders can prop up their power is through military action. It's through fear, that fear mongering the individuals. A partisan requires even short-term peace is detrimental to these leaders' hold on power, which is exactly why we think it's incredibly unclear why the partition will happen in the first place. It is still up to proposition to characterize on feasibility why this will happen, why they will agree, and exactly whether it will happen peacefully. We say it will not. Importantly, if they have low influence, like they say, they will be questioned. This is massive incentive not to do so. We think then these people don't want their countries at peace. They want all the land. As a consequence of this, they will keep fighting for a long time. Finally, we think as a consequence of partitioning, there will be increasing conflict within these zones, i.e. civil wars uprising within them. The case study of this is South Sudan, where as a result of partitioning, you had massive conflicts that existed from within. Right now, we think you only consolidate your sort of country internally through things like war. You blame each other. You blame the RSF blames the SAF and vice versa. And that's exactly how they keep some order within their country. And what they do on side proposition is they forcibly placate their people. The problem then is this forcible enforcement only will last so long. When people are questioning more, at the point is that I'm increasing disagreements between these governments, because importantly, these aren't established governments, there will be increasing civil war, which will lead to significantly more conflict. For example, since the 2000s, the biggest cause of death around the world was not country-to-country war. It was internal war within these countries, 5 times higher than country-to-country war. As a consequence of this, the very nature of conflicts and civil wars, it will often lead to increasing death tolls, which cannot be mitigated by side proposition. Finally, we think the RSF is not a government. They only include their power through a power grab. It is literally a breakout unit of their military. It is incredibly unclear why the people accept these generals as their leaders. In many instances, then, the ability to increase the violence within, the dysfunctional government that will be formed, as opposed to like some kind of military establishment, will lead to increasing instability, which will cause massive harm on their side of the house. The second argument, then, is why our counterfactual on why our counterfactual and intervening through the APU is actually far more effective. But before that, I'll take POI.
This is a proxy war. Why will escalation and intervention actually work other than escalate the conflict?
There's two things, right? The first thing is, despite this being a proxy war, there are still like specific incentives that generals in power have. These incentives will no longer change. But the second thing is, despite this funding, exactly the problem, why exactly will these other actors across the world, like the UAE, like Iran, not want to fund this anymore? They have, again, selfish incentives. You don't change these incentives, the war will continue. Finally, why do we think then this form of intervention is far more effective? One, what we would have then is the African forces, the APU, intervening. Why do we think they will intervene? First of all, for political pressures. There are regional instabilities as a consequence of the war within these areas. There are often massive spillover effects. You mess up the supply nets that often exist as a consequence of this, but also as a result of being neighboring countries. Countries like Kenya often have soldiers themselves killed in the crossfire as a result of having to have forced relations with the RSF. But two, there are often massive spillover of refugees that often cause massive economic harms as a consequence of this. Because as the war continues and people keep getting disenfranchised, you often have migration of these individuals, and the other countries in the neighboring have to bear this. But three, we think the AU specifically want to project stability through enforcement. They want to have the idea that we can deter future violence as a consequence of this. And the only way this can actually work is through some kind of intervention. This incentive does exist. But finally, we think there are economic benefits where the resources are not sold to Russia anymore. You can use the ports in Africa, which benefits you. We think this will be effective. One, because the only way we can curb these leaders' powers is through military action. But two, we think these militaries are relatively weak and we can weaken them. What is the upshot of this? We think the power of the APU can collapse these militaries. When they get weaker, one, we think in the long run, the people can have increased influence to set up their own governments. But two, if they can wipe them out entirely, we can set up our own democratic parliaments and governments through meetings through the UN or whatever. For these reasons, it's an incredibly clear opposition ballot.
Thank you, first opposition speaker, for that speech. Let's have the second top speaker here.
Okay, cool. Can you guys all hear me?
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. I take my POIs verbally. Feel free to just unmute and say POI. All right, cool. I'll get started in 3, 2, 1. We think that partition is the only way to ensure a certain level of political stability in this conflict. We think that this war is fundamentally one that breaks all rules of war theory. It breaks all rules of what we think humankind is capable of. We do not think that escalating the conflict by putting in more troops will meaningfully change the conflict at all. If not anything, it will make the conflict worse. What am I going to be talking about? One, what do we think the situation of the conflict is right now? I want to clear a few things up. Two, I'm going to explain why the alternative of this African Union army is absolutely ludicrous. And then I'm going to explain why partition will be done well, the benefits in terms of reducing human suffering, and then lastly, an idea on political state building. So let's talk about the current kind of situation that exists, right? We would argue that the conflict is so severe, it is so detrimental, it hurts so many people. In the first week, 10,000 people died. And notably, that they're looking for political power, right? That is to say that both sides have a certain sum cost fallacy. They have invested so much in such a violent conflict that losing is absolutely not an option. What this suggests is that they will increasingly up kind of the horrors that will be conducted in this war in order to win, because they have nothing to lose, right? The RSF has nothing to lose when it comes to fighting in this conflict. We think that when it is bankrolled by actors such as the UAE, it is impossible to win. And we think fundamentally the only way to rectify this need for political power is to give them political power through something like a partition. Thirdly, we would argue that this is a war largely motivated through momentum, right? That the war just has to keep on going because there's already been so much violence and people are scared. That is to say, we don't think that territorial claims, like who exactly gets a particular city, is particularly relevant in this debate. They point to Germany as a bad example of this, but in Berlin, if it's just one city, it wasn't even that bad in the first place. So we just don't think it's true that there are that many practical problems, right? They have other problems. I'm going to deal with those a little bit later. But the conclusion of this is that they want political power and they have the resources to continue, or at least they have the will to make it as violent as possible. Why is this their alternative of an African Union army genuinely ludicrous? It is the craziest idea I've ever heard. Let's be clear on the
POI.
stance of the AU, right? The AU has failed to fix human rights violations in Mali, in Burkina Faso. They tried to intervene in Sudan already by strongly condemning the actions of such a state. There is a revealed preference that the African Union is useless when it comes to these problems because there is absolutely no political will to do so. Why would you throw your own people into a conflict that is known to have a survival rate of close to zero? We think there is no political will for this whatsoever. We don't even think that the US wants to get involved in such a conflict, even when they have the capacity to, just because of how violent and terrible this conflict is going to be. So this idea that the African Union, right, something that has already been incredibly troubled across the past decades or so, is able to unify all of a sudden and have a united front and break into Sudan, I think is genuinely ridiculous and impractical. But we also say it's quite problematic, right? Because you have many competing actors now forming under one military, trying to take over one government. What this means is even more instability as fighters from all across Africa have different vested interests in the nation. You introduce the number of actors. The more actors you have, the more complicated the conflict. We think this is incredibly problematic. So I just don't think this African Union army thing is going to work out all that well. I just don't think it's going to happen. I think you need so much political will. The fact that for the past 40 years, they were just trying to form an African Union for purely economic purposes and have largely failed suggests that they're not getting a military army anytime soon. What did we tell you on why the partition was going to be done well? No, thank you. We gave two reasons. One, we told it that there is internal government buy-in from the RSF and the SAF in order to have a partition, because both governments want to say that they have won the conflict, both governments want to walk away with some kind of political win to prevent instability, and both governments fundamentally want some kind of control. They concede this. We give them this in a partition. We are not saying this partition process will be perfect, right? There will be quibbles. We completely understand. But the alternative under their side of the house is so unbelievably lucrative and so unbelievably violent in the scale in which an intervention would appear that we just don't think that this slight imperfection is worth it. But the second thing we told you, and this one entirely unresponded to, I'll take this after, is that there are external interests to prefer something such as a partition, right? So the UAE and Saudi Arabia still want gold. They still want the agricultural benefits that exist. The point at which you have a power sharing agreement or some kind of government that comes afterwards of their military intervention, if it happens, one side has fundamentally lost. We think this is unacceptable, right, to a power like Saudi Arabia. We think that they're just less likely to try to intervene in the conflict in a way to pressure the sides to come to a conclusion. So we think that whatever comes afterwards is also more problematic. We think a partition will be done at least somewhat well. It will happen. And notably, we think that the ceasefire that comes with it will be better maintained because you don't want to see the people that killed your neighbor very frequently. Let's be clear. They needed to imagine a world after they had this military intervention, one upon in which you are living next to the neighbor that violently murdered your husband or your wife. That is the reality you have to live in. We think a singular nation is impossible under their side of the house. That is the point we're making. To this, we heard virtually no response. Why then do we think there are... actually, you're right. I have to take a POI.
Currently, both sides are desperately fighting over Khartoum, and it's a big deciding factor in what is a win. A line has to be drawn somewhere. Who gets it?
Right. So once again, right, we got to think more into the long term. So there is probably going to be some kind of agreement to split Khartoum down the middle, or there is some actor in which it is like a neutral zone, right? So you establish that no one is allowed to have Khartoum, and you split the country down east-west. There are multiple alternatives to this. I'm sure there are economics people and IR people that can come up with it better. We don't think that the problem is actually Khartoum, right? We think the problem is that both sides want political control of the whole country, and the point at which you split the country in half, the incentive to go after Khartoum decreases significantly. So we don't think it really matters. Okay, why do we think we're better at political state building? And notice the strategic implication of this theme. If it is true that both sides at some point will have, the conflict will end, right? Under their side of the house, you go in, you massacre the people and irrespective and try to instill a democratic government, or under our side of the house you have these kind of RSF and SAS. Their response is to say, well, the RSF is not really a government, right? They don't really know what's going on. Beyond the fact this is empirically not true, the RSF and the SAF literally had a power sharing agreement right before the conflict started. That's kind of how we got to the place that we did. We don't think that the RSF is unskilled, right? And even if they are unskilled, we think they're able to import probably someone in order to manage their government just fine. But I would also argue that when you have a partition, you have some kind of guaranteed stability. So even if it is true that in reality, nothing really changes, there's still some instability, we would argue that international investors, banking institutions, developmental aid organizations perceive it as such, perceive that under our side of the house, you're more stable because you have separated the two actors. It's like two people fighting, right? You have like separate them and put them into different rooms. And so what this means then is you get more development aid towards the country. What this means, you have more of a capacity to do things like building a democratic state. But even if a democratic state is not possible, we would tell you that stability is a prerequisite to any kind of like meaningful access to rights and freedoms. Notice the absolute devastation you will cause if you literally march an army into Sudan, right? This means that everyone is indiscriminately going to be harmed. We think this is incredibly problematic and much worse than under our side of the house. Once a military, notice their language, a military organization is able to take over and run the government. Who is this organization? Why will they run it well? At least we give you structural reasons why under our side of the house, both of these groups have some kind of leadership experience, some incentives to continue to export gold in order to facilitate trade, in order for them to secure their borders. These are not incentives that exist under their side of the house. It was incredibly unstrategic for the other side to suggest that their incentive is military intervention. We told you they do not have the fiat, and even if they did, the harms would be so incredibly detrimental, incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you so much, second prop speaker, for that fine speech. Let's have the second opposition speaker here.
Hi, just checking my audibility.
Yes, you are audible. Please
Cool.
go ahead.
Lovely. All right, lovely. I'll take PY as bubbly. Let me take you back to South Sudan. In 2008, there was a partition. The governments decided that they wanted to rule on their own. 3 years later, the most horrific civil war of that specific region. Hundreds, if not thousands of people died. All of this occurred because the actors you institutionalized as legitimate rulers did not know how to take care of their people. So 2 questions in my speech. Firstly, why the conflict is not going to end after partition and actually conflict is likely to persist, and secondly, why proposition has bad nation building. On the first question, I'm just going to deal with their model a bit here. They tell you that they're going to divide based on current controls, and then we point out that Khartoum is what most people are fighting over. Proposition second speaker tells you Khartoum's not very important, dude. It is the capital of Sudan in a relatively underdeveloped country. It is the only place with legitimate infrastructure. The vast majority of people live in Khartoum, and it's really the only metric of success because historically it has been the most important part of the country. No side is ever going to want to concede this specific area. That is why, even though right now there is a de facto partition that was set up by the International Working Group, it didn't work because they continue to fight over Khartoum. That is why thousands, if not hundreds of people are dying in Khartoum on a day-to-day basis because these actors care about taking that specific region over entirely. What this means is Khartoum is the tipping point for both of these rulers, and they want control over Khartoum because that's the easiest way to show that they've actually won the capital of the nation, which means that at the point at which Khartoum is split, they're not just going to be fine with it, they're going to continue conflicting over it because they can't just split infrastructure 50-50 because that means that directly that like a lot of the supply lines that exist right now are going to be disrupted as well. But the problem is that they don't broadly prove the incentive. Firstly, why these actors will agree to the partition in the first place. Because they agree with proposition's first speaker that both of these leaders do want control. Let me actually explain what this control looks like. It is broadly through the economy. The problem is that you can't just control one half of Sudan and run a stable nation. Because Sudan is separated in a way where the West is dominated with gold mines, but it's actually only the East that has agricultural land and a strong coastline through which you're able to export the gold. So at that point, given the only way to operate your country economically is to actually have control of the entire nation, there is no incentive for them to just be fine with the areas that they have right now. All of this broadly means is we agree that they want to win, but they want to win through 2 things. Firstly, capturing Khartoum, but secondly, and more broadly having greater control over the supply lines across the entire country, because that's the only meaningful way that they're actually able to make money. And crucially, on their comparative, even if you set up a partition, why are they going to stop fighting? If these proxy forces are true, and given these incentives exist, we think they still have the capacity to break this partition. If all of their mechanisms on countries not wanting to intervene is true, we don't think this is likely to happen. But all of this means is that the partition itself is not going to be bloodless. Blood is going to be shed, and we don't think stability is going to be reached in the place where it matters the most. And all of this broadly just means that the first argument largely doesn't manifest. Let me now deal with why our model is probably better. Firstly, on the African Peacekeeping Union, they tell you that they've failed so far. We think that's exactly why they want to change things right now. But more broadly, let me give you some incentives. Firstly, is that the Sudan war at large is causing a massive refugee spillover to all neighboring countries. This is not just Ethiopia, this is not just a Central African Republic, but it's also secondary impacts like a lot of Sudanese refugees flowing down to Kenya. Like all of these things are affecting countries at large, and this is something that they don't want to continue. Secondly, is that Sudan becoming more stable is beneficial for the entire region, because Sudan has one of the largest coastlines for an individual country in Africa. Ethiopia lacks a coastline right now and have to rely on Djibouti. If Sudan is more peaceful, they can work with Sudan and actually get these coastlines. But crucially, on our comparative is the only way you actually get stability, because they tell you that proxies exist, so you're actually unable to implement actual solutions like peacekeeping forces. Here's the thing. Proxies right now operate in a moral and legal gray area. Right now, Iran only funds the SAF in response to the UAE funding it. The UAE is able to get away with it right now because they actually have not claimed liability to any of the things that they're shipping into Iran or shipping into Sudan. What this means is at a point at which African forces are on the ground in Sudan and they're being shot down with weapons funded by the UAE. That is when the UAE can no longer continue this, because there's a clear external harm posed to one of the neighbors that UAE wants to still maintain relationships with. But broadly, we think the UAE actually benefits from an AU intervention, because surely they're probably getting better deals through like a stabilized country than just the RAF. But even if this is untrue, given UAE already has a lot of increasing pressures on this specific problem, like for example, right now their relationship with Saudi Arabia is going down because of the intervention in Sudan, we think the likely option is that UAE is going to pull out when there are going to be more the African forces that are coming in. Crucially, this is the actual precondition to weaken both forces, because both have proxy forces that are willing to fund them to no end. And it is at that point when you remove proxy forces that they become significantly weaker, because they no longer have the ability to buy weapons. They no longer have money. They're no longer able to pay their troops on a day-to-day basis. All of this means is that proxy actors are likely to move away on our comparative directly as a consequence of African Union intervention. Why is this better then? When you remove proxies, means that money falls. But secondly, is we think over time, you're probably going to be able to set up civilian governments at the point where you meaningfully weaken both of these groups and probably have now taken over Khartoum to a large extent. Crucially, people want this. Do you think the people that live in RSF and SAF controlled areas are happy with it? No. Most of the rapes that happen in these regions happen within these regions because the soldiers have a monopoly over violence, so they're able to get away with whatever they want simply for their pure sick pleasure. All of this means is that the people want this reform, and when governments are likely to push in and propose an alternative, they're likely to follow through with this as well. So we think roughly in the long term, outcomes are two things. Either one, you fully win, in which instance we probably set up civilian governments, or secondly, that both forces become significantly weak, which is the only point at which you're actually able to control them. Before I want my second question, one person POI.
So can you name one successful African peace union intervention in all of Africa? Presumably not, because it's never happened before.
Just because there were bad interventions in the past, you can't just say that's going to be bad in the future as well. You need to deal with our mechanisms. That's kind of how this debate works. Secondly, on why Proposition probably has bad nation building. Proposition tells you that these countries are now going to want to avoid casualties and assault. But like, why is this going to change? Because these systems on that comparative are built on violence. Proposition tells you, oh, they have empirical existence or empirical evidence of them ruling these places. But the problem is they've been ruling through violence. You can't say anything about the RSF or SAF if you live there. You will be shot and killed, which means that there's no incentive for them to change these things. But secondly, note their alternative on accountability. The problem is, guess who's at the top of the ICC and ICJ list? It is these leaders, which means they don't want international accountability. So they have to pick one of two things. Either one, they get accountability, which in case like all the peace doesn't happen, or two, that the victims don't get justice. But crucially, on their comparative, even if all of this is untrue, the economy is going to be horrible. This is because Sudan was not built to be two separate economies. It needs each other to survive. You need agricultural goods from the east for food in the west. You need gold from the west to survive in the east. All of this means is that Sudanese economy just cannot work when it's split. All of this means is that people are going to be unhappy. When people are unhappy, guess what happens on your comparative? They get shot in the head because there's no accountability measures. We think on our comparative, probably in the possibility of government, we can reform a lot of these. All these reasons, this is a ballot for.
Thank you so much, Speaker, for that fine speech. And Observer, could you please mute?
I'm sorry, was everything clear?
Yeah, it was clear, but it was very annoying hearing something like a voice that was
sorry,
not
I
yours.
also had to mute my device at the 7th minute because I was like getting distracted.
Yeah, I could hear everything. It was just like weird hearing something that was not you. Observer, is the host here? I'm so sorry, I sound. Oh, I'm so sorry, I sound mean. Okay. I'm sorry I sound mean. I usually get annoyed whenever I get distracted. So sorry about that, everybody. Thank you so much, second up, for that fine speech. Now let's have the third proposition speaker. And just a bit of announcements. Observers, please be careful so you don't accidentally unmute. Everyone is trying to concentrate on the speaker, and hearing a foreign voice just throws some of us off track. So please try not to unmute. And it's okay if you accidentally do that. Just make sure you just mute back quickly. Thank you so much. Let's have the third prop speaker. Yo.
Am I audible, visible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
To look to the most relevant comparison for this debate was not between any previous African Union intervention, perhaps, as the other side would say, but it's between Sudan and South Sudan. The reason why there is a period of relative peace between the two new nations is that the conflict would have been worse if you kept these two countries together. You allow Sudan to oppress the south of Sudan. Keeping the partitions separate allowed for effective nation building and allowed for the delivery of aid. And for those reasons, then, we stand for that effective nation building and peace. We stand on proposition. In this speech, I'm going to ask two questions, the answers to which should prove to you why we're winning. First, how do we get more peace? Second, how do we get better long-term nation building? In terms of peace, I'd just like to note to you here, the uphill battle against intuition the other side is fighting in this debate against every conceivable alternative. But in 2023, there was a mass attempt by regional powers to deliver aid. That failed. In 2024, those same groups plus some additional countries tried to do a ceasefire. It was broken immediately. And we're talking about the African Union. We know that the African Union historically hasn't done much. I think the fact is, whether they can talk about whether this African Union conflict is similar to other ones, the fact is that they can't name a single example of a time when the African Union has been effective in engaging in any conflict, let alone the bloodiest one that the continent has seen in many years. In terms of the quibbles, then, in terms of our comparative, was first in terms of the question of Khartoum, how do you deal with it? We think the answer was quite simple, that you get probably something like a Jerusalem situation. You get a country or a city that is divided. This isn't ideal, but it's preferable to total war in a densely populated area that is crucial for both parties. Probably better, though, than Jerusalem, because there isn't a massive military might imbalance between the two parties. But second, though, what is the comparative that they offer here? Because presumably, to solve their problem of having Khartoum not be under the power of two states, that implies that one state has to win the war, which implies that one side likely gets mass genocided, everyone dies, there is likely zero accountability and massive amounts of victors' justice. And additionally, we think that both parties, both the RSF and the SAF, despite being, unpopular to some extent, we do think that there are people who sympathize with them, who say that they're the lesser of the evils that are possible. That at the very least, the SAF presided over a period of relative peace and stability for Sudan in the last few decades, so the SAF has at least some track record, and the RSF has some sympathizers because it aligns with people who perceive the SAF as being run by some Nile River elite. We do think that these two parties, though not necessarily popular, we don't think most politicians are popular. We think at least these two parties have some amount of legitimacy, and so we think that like having one be totally flattened is not going to be to the good of a significant portion of either population. We think then that their comparative is woefully insufficient for answering what they call the most important question in in terms of peace, which is Khartoum. They tell you from a game theory perspective, secondly, that both of the parties hate each other and that will stop peace. I'd like to note here that no country operates on absolutes, they operate on expectations. That is to say that the RSF is going to be able to exceed their expectations because they perceive themselves as the underdog in this war because of the history of the SAF being in power as the more legitimate military force. And so them getting any territory at all is a win. We see the SAF is likely to consider a win if peace happens because they are scarred by the genocide that the RSF committed. We think that this is a better alternative than that. Why is it, though, that this peace will not happen on either side, even if both parties would want it? It's because of a collective action problem where neither side trusts that the other side, if left to their own devices, will come to some sort of peaceful agreement. The other trouble, though, is that getting the African Union involved is not sufficient for a number of reasons. I'm going to address some direct refutation to that in a brief moment, but just in terms of how this applies to this unique clash on whether or not the two parties will come to peace. The fact is, the African Union or the neighboring African states are not the primary bankrollers of this war. If you look to any civil war in history, take the Lebanese Civil War, for example, the only good peace resolution that was ever passed for that war involved the United States and involved Saudi Arabia, because those were the backers monetarily. Those were the ones that had the most to gain from the war and the least to lose because they were insulated from the conflict. We think if you don't have regional powers these global powers getting involved, any peace you have will ultimately be unsustainable. Therefore, our comparative that you get a partition that is mediated by these powers, or at least has some amount of their involvement, is likely to be much more stable. Therefore, both parties will probably trust that with one another that they will not immediately relapse back into war. We think then that you solve the collective action problem that exists on their side. Before I move on, sure, I'll take the point.
Would the UAE fund a gun that kills a Kenyan child soldier?
I think there are reasons why they would, sure. It is probably not the most likely, just because you don't want to kill a child soldier, but I do think that the UAE has vested interests in terms of making sure that they get access to the natural resources they're trying to gain. I think there are ways in which you can get away with killing child soldiers. I think this POI is rather ignorant to the situation of do child soldiers that are sent in from foreign militaries, yes, they die sometimes. It's not exactly like a soldier in the heat of the moment is considering the geopolitical or reputational consequences. Let's talk now, though, about their comparative, because I'd like you to note here, for them to have any chance of winning this debate, they had to prove why their comparative worked. 3 reasons why the African Union is insufficient. First, there's no political will to engage in this intervention. Partition is easy because Saudi, the UAE, or Iran, Russia, the US, who are all implicated in some capacity of this conflict, would only have to expend a very small proportion of their total geopolitical resources to addressing this. Whereas with the African Union, it is a much larger geopolitical burden on them. They have lower capacity, so we think then that they would prefer to engage in partition. Especially since the war, as Jade said, has a literally almost 0% survival rate. Refugees are much less of a political scandal than sending people in to go and die. Second, will the intervention succeed at all? There are 2 characterizations for how the intervention could go. Neither are good. Either one, every conceivable ally gets involved. So you have Ethiopia and Libya for the RSF, you have Egypt for the SAF. But this is bad because obviously the war will go on forever. Both sides believe they can win because both sides are getting bankrolled. The alternative is that only one side wins, which is, from their analysis, what they seem to prefer. Likely the SAF wins. Egypt is the closer backer, so the RSF gets completely devastated, as does all of the southwestern region of the nation. In either case, the war will be long and bloody because it is an urban war, so it is very difficult to avoid civilian casualties. And we also think that leads to the proliferation of the war, because when your relatives die, you're likely to enlist. But third, even if intervention ends the war, how does it increase the odds of backsliding? No, thank you. We think that when you have more dead people and more poverty and more trauma in the country, that increases the odds of going back into war. But also, when you have all these countries getting involved, they end up leaving arms and military infrastructure that presumably the backers invest into this country, so that even when the war ends, the odds are that the 2 parties can go back to warring with each other. They then say that you're going to form a civilian government. We think, first, what's the capacity here? You have a bunch of dead people in your country. Who's going to run it? But second, they never prove why the civilian government will be good. That is to say that in power vacuums, a lot of new governments are bad because the types of people that tend to win in the power vacuums are the most domineering and perhaps the least reasonable. Why is our comparative preferable to theirs? Best and worst case. Best case on both sides is that the war is solved. We agree. But the worst case is that on their side, there is a much bloodier conflict because of the blood and arms that end up getting brought into the nation. Let's talk lastly then about long-term development. They tell you that economics ends up being terrible. This is their main contribution under this second clash. But I think that the countries, hate each other. They trade with each other all the time. Israel receives a lot of natural resources and stuff from the West Bank, for example. But we also gave you a couple deadlock breakers here. First, ones that were much more certain. That is to say that the IMF, the World Bank, and no aid organization can enter into a functional war zone, nor can they negotiate with a country that isn't a de jure, legitimate ruler. So that is to say that the regions that the RSF runs, because they're perceived as less legitimate, are trapped into infinite poverty for the rest of time. And even if you disagree with the RSF as a government, recognize that there are civilians there too that are innocent. And then we also think that you get ICC justice because you cannot engage, you can use the ICC compliance as a condition for the partition, as was the case in East Timor. What Jade also tells you about proxy wars has unique impacts. That is to say that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are adversarial. If this war is not perceived as a win for either side and it does not end well, you are likely to see them continuing to back countries like Yemen, Somalia, and Libya. We refuse to set that bad precedent, so we stand on side proposition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, third prop speaker, for that speech. Now let's have the third opposition speaker here.
Sorry, give me 1 second to pull up my timer.
Sure.
The structure of my speech is going to be very simple. I'm going to talk about why their solution doesn't work, both in the enforcement of the partition, then what happens in state building afterwards, and explain this why the same is true on our comparative, why our case works, and why potential solution on our side is actually a lot better. I want to point out the devastating hole in that case in my first clash, which is that even though they have the fiat to explain that there is going to be a partition, they never explain to you why that partition is actually going to last. And the simple problem that we've identified down the bench is that both sides hate each other. War crimes have been committed against each other. There is no clean way of separating Khartoum. There's no clean way of dividing these resources. It is unclear what holds them together. Both sides, then they themselves have pointed out to you, want control over the entire country. And the reason that anything less than that is unsatisfactory is because the country barely functioned when it was whole. It is not going to function when it is in two halves, especially when all the infrastructure is split between those two halves, and you need those halves to cooperate well. So I want to point out that they need to explain to me why this partition is going to hold, because it is bad to use a solution that then just, destroys itself within a few years of its creation. And that just never happened. So that implication alone should win us this debate, especially because their biggest harm against us was that we don't actually get the buy-in for our claim. So on that alone, that contribution should win us this debate. But let me explain what that requires then. It requires that the countries that they're talking about force these governments into a ceasefire or force these governments into a partition. And I'm unclear exactly how that's going to happen because they've already talked to you about how a lot of these actors don't want to be involved. So potentially temporarily, they create these different lines for these countries. Potentially temporarily, they force these governments to stop fighting. It's unclear why that lasts into the long term. And I want to point out that that is actually a terrible problem. So let me explain why, in the second point, why even if you somehow get this partition surviving for a decent amount of time, why it's unlikely that they're going to actually have good governance in the future. They say a couple things here, and the main claim that comes out in their last speech is that countries still trade with each other even if they hate each other. But I don't think that that's very nuanced here. Both countries not only hate each other, but they want the other one not to exist, because the existence of those countries taking control of those gold mines and having that port and having that agricultural land means that I can't have that agricultural land. It means that my people are still dissatisfied because I am not governing properly, which is why it is a literal opportunity cost for me to trade with these countries and allow for that stability. And I want to point out exactly how the RSF and the SAF currently function. They are not good at governing. And Sudan has just never been a country that has known how to govern itself, which is why it's split 4 different ways. And it's just a terrible example of poor governance. So I want to point out that these military organizations, like they say, run through momentum, and the only way to maintain that momentum is to promise that they will actually get something out of it, is to promise to continue this war. And I'm unclear as to how they're going to benefit it. They say a couple other things here, that the IMF and the World Bank can't enter into a war zone and they're going to enter on their side. I'm unclear why the IMF and the World Bank are going to enter into a newly birthed country that is unlikely to survive. That is a clash that is logically subsequent to what logically comes after the idea of having stability there in the first place. And we've explained to you that this idea that you can trade with each other even if you hate each other is just not a good enough mechanism. It is just simply a one-liner. We want to point out that these countries just don't have good governance. And let me explain to you why these countries and why these governance isn't actually going to work, which is a few things. firstly, that they have never governed before. They say, oh, they were good at governing at some point, that they actually had some kind of, power sharing agreement, but that lasted for all of 5 minutes. And I want to point out that they've ruled through violence. So if their claim is you have stability, the only way that stability lasts is through violence, is through these countries literally cracking down on their people. And we think that that is necessarily a bad thing. We don't think that these countries are suddenly going to sing kumbaya and hold hands and have good trade networks with each other. But the more important question becomes about Khartoum, and they've just not answered this properly. They've said Jerusalem worked well. My question is this: you literally just cannot split infrastructure down the middle. Both sides are going to want to claim the sorts of infrastructure that exists on either side of Khartoum. It is where the majority of people live in this country. Are you going to build a wall through it? How are you going to actually divide these resources? It is just incredibly unclear. And I think both countries are going to want to consolidate control over their halves of Khartoum in the instance that that's what's going to happen. And that's just going to create even more conflict, because exactly where the line is drawn is going to be a huge source of conflict, like we've seen in so many different case studies, like after World War I and World War II, when land gets divided. We just think that broadly, there is going to be potentially some small short-term peace, and I'm going to trade that off now. So the way here is that potentially they get less casualties in the short term. The problem is there's a bad government that is created on either side of the partition. They continue violating the rights of the people and ruling through terror, because that is literally the only way they can survive. They aren't going to create a good government that's going to have the level of stability that is required. Because again, if the East controls all the food going into the West, they're just not going to give them any food, because that just benefits them, and that weakens them. And in the long term, they can actually take them over. That just creates more suffering. So our weighing is maybe they get that one benefit of short-term casualty, but we have the potential for long-term peace, and that's better because they just default into our worst case anyway after the partition starts to break. Let me just illustrate this very clearly. Look, my point here is, if there's a cockroach in the other room, even if I'm guaranteed to get rid of it by bombing it, I shouldn't do it, because the bombing creates a worse problem. And that's exactly what happens on their side when these countries start to fail the moment at which they are just incapable of governing. You just can't have the UN and the US and the UAE making a sustainable government. Like, clearly nation building does not work in the instances that we've seen before in Afghanistan when these sorts of organizations have tried to get involved. They're not going to get MNCs and all these other strong stability derived organizations just because there's some idea of a presentation of security within these regions, or this perception of it, because like it is still literally like when you look at South Sudan being the exact predecessor to this exact situation, we think they're just not going to go into it. South Sudan is exactly the example we want to use, and it is still terrible in South Sudan. There is still warfare and conflict. What is our case then? Firstly, I want to point out that we've given you mechanization as to why these countries are going to intervene, and their biggest claim is that like it doesn't work. If this is true, let's just say in the worst case, we can't fiat into existence our counterfactual. We still win, because we pointed out to you why the degradation of a country after the partition fails just means you've wasted resources. It means more people die in the interim. It means these governments create even more separation within those new countries. And then when the partition falls eventually, you just have an even more confusing conflict, which just results in more people dying. But let me explain why our model actually does work. And that's very simple, which is that we've given you incentives as to why regional powers want to construct some stability within this region, why the large powers they talk about, and that's their big contribution here, that the US and Saudi aren't going to stop funding, the UAE aren't going to stop funding it. The point we've made is very clear. You just don't want to kill African Union soldiers, because those soldiers are also part of countries that you respect and you trade with. It just becomes much more difficult. The benefit of engaging in Sudan at that point just reduces. We think more likely they're actually probably going to try and aid us in this process of creating some kind of stability and control within this region. Let me just weigh why our solution is better, even if we don't gain control of the entire country. Their claim is this: either that there's no solution, or one side wins in a genocide of the other. That isn't true. What our best case scenario is where you actually gain control, you weaken both these governments enough, and we've given you a bunch of mechanisms as to why we have superior resources if you have the APU, that we can just restrict the arms flowing into the country that just weakens these leaders. If we do manage to do that, what we can do is prosecute both leaders equally and create some level of peace. I come from a country where we had a bitter civil war for 26 years, but you can get peace after that. I can still debate with a Tamil person on my very team. We think it is absolutely possible. The reason this is better is our best case trumps theirs, given that you don't destroy the country and cut it in half, and its resources still function together. So the outcome is an actually sustainable country in the long term. We want to point out that even in the case where one side wins, it doesn't come at the cost of genocide on the other side. It is just that side starts to weaken, and really all the people who die are the generals and the people in control. There isn't a division on ethnic lines in this country like there was in like India and in Sri Lanka, which means that even if there is some some level of cracking down. It's not going to be to the same level. And broadly, peace exists into the long term. Again, with a unified country that has its resources intact. And for those reasons, stability is better.
Thank you, third opposition speaker, for that fine speech. Now let's have the reply speech from opposition. You have 4 minutes.
Hi, just checking audibility.
Yes, you are audible. Please go ahead.
Lovely. Two questions in my speech. Firstly, is the end to the war exclusive? Firstly, the question we need to ask is whether the partition will last. We told you that they have an incentive to specifically take over regions like Khartoum because it is something that they clearly want to win. But secondly, is for the economy to work sufficiently that they actually want to have control over the entire economy. And we think this incentive supersedes. But more importantly, is that they lack the incentive to actually stop fighting because they mutually benefit from gaining more control. Because actually, we point out later that when they move into a civilian government, this increases the likelihood of things like future accountability. So they currently benefit from remaining in a wartime zone because that's something that helps them prop up their power and the military monopoly that they have. But secondly, this was largely unclear as to why this partition will hold over time. Look at the example of South Sudan. It only takes one small trigger when both sides hate each other for the entire house of cards on proposition to come tumbling down. But the second question is, will the alternative work? Perhaps it is weak, and perhaps that is true. But all of our responses pointed out that countries have the incentive to intervene. Perhaps the capacity is mitigated, perhaps them alone cannot win the entire war. But our claim is very, very simple. When there's a couple of Kenyan soldiers on the ground and they are likely to be hurt by weapons funded by the UAE, that is the point at which they pull out because that causes massive international repercussions for them that they want to avoid. This means that the major funding source, the major source through which they get the money to fund their weapons and pay their troops on the ground for RSF and SAF, their counterpart is Iran and Egypt, also are massively taken out, which means that the amount of forces you need to take over to win this war is also significantly lower on our comparative because proxy forces pull out as well. All of this broadly means is even if the African peacekeeping force is weaker, they're fighting against a much, much weaker target, which means they're able to take it out. We think in a war of attrition, it is likely in the future that forces are going to win. The conclusion of this clash is perhaps to be charitable and say that the partition is faster and it is established. And secondly, is that the casualties that we have to incur on our comparative in the short term is also greater. This leads to the second question on good governance. Proposition tells you they want to trade. Perhaps these economic incentives exist, but this also exists at the cost of the other economy benefiting as well. But even if this is untrue, the problem we said was absent economy. This is that horrible rule. The problem is that the same people that have been plundering your own land, that have been assaulting the women around you, are the ones that now control these specific regions. They don't disprove that this violence that occurs is targeted to another region. So it is likely, like what we said in our second speech, that it is often concentrated because soldiers can get away with whatever they want to do. What this means on their comparative then is that even if a government is established, it is likely to be one that continues to oppress people. I'm sure they'll say accountability. I think accountability is taken out because the last thing you'd want as a leader of the RSF or SAF is to be arrested. And we think as a consequence of this, you're probably also going to have limitations on all the international support they claim as well. Because if you reject the ICC, it also sets up increased barriers for the IMF to come in and operate as well. But crucially is that on their comparative, the parties are likely to benefit from having some level of instability. Because when people have a voice and people can voice that the economy is not treating them that well, that is the point at which they're likely to protest. And they want to avoid this. And the easiest way for them to do this is oppressing the people continually, because that's what they've been able to do so far. They've not proven why governments are likely to reform. They've not proven why the current system wants to change. They've not proven why the soldiers that are going to the soldiers that previously assaulted people are not going to become generals on their comparative. All of this broadly means is, let's say that the partition works, that the countries are set up. But at what cost? The people still suffer on a day-to-day basis. I'm willing to trade off short-term casualties, but on that comparative, the casualties don't end. They persist on a day-to-day basis under a government that continues to oppress you. In our world, perhaps short-term casualties are greater, but since we meaningfully proved some end to the conflict, we think given the people want reform, we think civilian governments are far more likely. Most importantly, as long as we take the two leeches away that are ruining Sudan, we think civilian governments are likely to work.
Thank you so much, opposition reply speaker, for that fine speech. Now let's have the proposition reply speaker. Here.
Okay, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
Okay. Sri Lanka lets perfect be the enemy of good. Look, our solution is imperfect. Their solution is imperfect. Any solution to this conflict is imperfect. The crucial problem in Sri Lanka's strategy is there's genuinely zero reasoning as to why their intervention is actually going to work in the ways they want to suggest. That is half the round, and they must explain why it is comparatively better. Third opposition says you shouldn't bomb a cockroach. That is definitionally what their policy is doing when you add fuel to the fire. That is why we stand proudly on proposition. The first thing I want to do is weigh the worst case in this round. And I don't think it is what their op block tries to weigh. It is not the best case we should weigh on, because probably the best case won't occur on either side of the house. Rather, we should weigh on the worst cases, because those are the most abundant scenarios in this round. And the worst case weighing is this, right? If our policy fails, nothing happens. The thing that you get is the status quo, where generals already rule over these areas, where they already perpetrate things like starvation, where war still occurs on our side. But on their side of the house, the worst case is that they inflame conflict, that there's far more catastrophe and far more death on their side of the house. The only reasoning as to why they say this intervention is going to be good is because there's good incentives. But like, first, as we suggest, there's different incentives from different countries. This is a massive overgeneralization of African countries. This is a proxy war. Clearly, there are different incentives amongst different governments. But secondly, even if there's good incentive, the problems with the intervention are inherent to intervention, right? It just will lead to more catastrophe. It just will lead to more death in the ways that we explained. So why is this counterfactual on their side just problematic and independently round losing for their side? That hundreds of thousands of people died needlessly on their side, that they bring in more arms, that they bring in more soldiers, and along with those soldiers and arms, they bring in more blood and death. That is better than the status quo, because it is genuinely unfathomable amounts of catastrophe on their side. But secondly, we also flip their long-term analysis, right? The second argument that they never deal with is that conflict track is far more likely on their side, that intervention oftentimes leaves behind arms, for instance, that it is difficult to move on from the economic destitution of a conflict when you have no ability to get recognition, when you have no ability to get aid, when you have no ability to get investment and development, and all the crucial things that legitimize governments that you get through a partition and our solution. They say you're going to get a civilian government, but when has this ever worked, right? It is horrible because there's massive amounts of power vacuums on their side of the house. Third tries to weigh this over like nation building. They try and weigh the short-term consequences as worthwhile. One, their counterfactual doesn't work as well. We explain why the one-state solution will never work when there's no trust, even if it's true that the people who killed your family are now like bordering countries. The comparative on their side is that they work in the same country and same government. Clearly, that is ineffective. But secondly, that there is a margin of our side of the house. I think the war continuing is just the largest impact in this round, because that is the worst case scenario and the most likely to perpetrate death and catastrophe. Secondly, then, let's talk about why our solution will actually work. Look, our claim here was never that there's perfect peace, right? It was better than the alternative. It was better than the war continuing. They concede that there is a short-term benefit, and that is something that we're willing to take. But I would also just point out that many of the problems they identify here are nitpicky, right? That they talk about, for instance, Khartoum, whereas like this will probably be solved by experts and advisors. You'll probably get a division like Jerusalem. But the comparative on their side is just far worse when you perpetrate a mass genocide on their side of the house. And note that there are illustrations of partitions working, right? That Czechoslovakia, for instance, or Montenegro all had massive like effective partitions on our side of the house. Even if there were some human consequences, it was an acceptable end to the conflict. Why is this likely to occur on our side? Firstly, that you can bring the SAF and the RSF to the bargaining table, that you can defund both proxies from both sides, as our model suggests, that both sides are scarred by conflict, that both sides don't have infinite capacity for the conflict to keep going. And their concession that regional actors will care about regional stability is precisely one of the reasons as to why this will occur, but also that the RSF and SAF get what they want on our side, right? That they can claim victory to supporters, that they both get territory and control. That is only possible when there's trust underlying the agreement, and that never occurs on their side of the house. Their main response and qualm is this economics, gold, ports thing. Our response is that there still can be trade, right? There still can be trade, as you see in Israel and Palestine. I think their nitpicky illustrations just don't defeat the core of our case. For those reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you so much, Proposition Reply Speaker, for that fine speech, and thanks to everyone else for that very fine debate. Good luck. Announcements will be made later. So, judges on the finals panel, please meet me in the opposition room, which I hope still exists. Let me just check quickly. Oh, it does. So meet me in the opposition prep room. If you're not on the finals panel, please don't join. Thank you.
Thank you for the debate, guys.
Good round, everyone.
Good round. Thanks, guys.